Let's go ahead and get started. Thank you all for being here, of course. Really happy to welcome you all to our conversation today on rethinking and decolonizing the Newark Museum. And of course, most of you know me. I'm Greg Stevens, the director of the Museum Professions Program and also the director of the Institute of Museum Ethics here at Seton Hall. And for those of you who don't know about the Institute of Museum Ethics, our primary goal is to bring colleagues together like this to discuss critical ethical issues in the museum field, and also to do so in an online environment. Hi, Claudia. Glad you're here with us. I'm going to go ahead and give this to you. And so the Institute of Museum Ethics has been around for quite a few years, and we're just working to revitalize it, and this programming is a part of that. I should also mention that this particular program is made possible by the Robert Lehman Foundation, who funded our March 20th lecture on decolonizing the museum, and most of you were here for that program featuring Cinnamon Catlin Gutko. And so this is a two-part series, and the Robert Lehman Foundation has been generous enough to fund a lecture through the Museum Professions Program for quite a few years, and so we're really, really pleased to have their continued support. For those of you who are interested in tweeting this, I hope that you will, please use any of these handles or hashtags. How many of you are object people? How many of you are object and audience people? All right, there you go. And so the work that you do, that you have done previously, obviously informs the work you do now at the Newark Museum. So maybe you can talk a little bit about some of what you did at the Brooklyn Museum and what you bring to your work now.
Sure. At the Brooklyn Museum, we focused a lot on, as an exhibitions curator, a lot on the visitor experience. I think that ripped me out of any lingering sense of academic preciousness that I had, and don't tend to think of myself in those terms. But I did get a PhD in art history, and I do like to write. And it was really good for me to be at an institution where there was so much focus put on really editing, editing, and also thinking about it's not just the wall text. Sometimes it's the wall color, it's the interpretive accessories, sometimes a film or an object of material culture that'll wake up everything else around it. So I think it was just like, in a way, it was like boot camp being at the Brooklyn Museum too, because it's such a big, staff-wise, it's such a bigger institution, so that you really had, this double-edged thing of the support of all these different professional departments, but also in some ways the paddle wheel of always having to go and interface and make sure that you checked with so-and-so that this is okay. 19 other curators to sort of be in balance with. So I took that kind of very hard worker spirit back to the Newark Museum, where it's really needed because we're a very lean staff. So yeah, just sort of melding deep research and high production value. Those are from the two institutions, we were just commenting that they're actually, the Brooklyn Museum and the Newark Museum are almost these sort of twin sons of a different mother, or twin mothers of a different father, because of their global collections, their rootedness in the community. Both started from a librarian, Walt Whitman in one case, or John Contavena in the other. And I don't know if you guys know this, I'm probably not, but the Brooklyn Museum also used to be the Brooklyn Institute of Art and Science. So, and the Newark Museum is art and science. So that kind of almost Renaissance perception of all things mattering and finding a way to communicate that to everybody, not just people who maybe are specialists.
Thanks. And Shirley, you haven't always been the title you are now over all these years at the Newark Museum, so maybe you can talk a little bit about your career path.
Going to the Newark Museum, I went to Science High School, which is in Newark. So that was kind of like my hangout spot after school when we couldn't go into the library. So while I'm in college, I'm looking to make some extra cash. There was a catering sign down the street saying, "Come to the Newark Museum." I go to apply for the catering job, and the assistant director of education is there. And she said, "What do you do?" I said, "I'm in nursing school." And she said, "Can you teach science?" And I said, "Sure." And she took me into this closet, pulled out a box of bones, and said, "Teach me." And I did, and she hired me on the spot. And she was my mentor, so I started working at the Newark Museum as a science educator, teaching science to homeschoolers and Saturday workshops. It progressed from there to where I transitioned to the art side. So I'm teaching art and science as a part-time educator. I became the first full-time educator at the Newark Museum, senior museum educator to teach art and science. I went on from the full-time educator to become manager of school programs, progressed to senior manager of school and teacher programs, to director of school youth and family programs. So that's where I'm at.
There's hope for us.
There's
And if
hope.
I had known that you were going to be a caterer, I would have asked you for some help earlier today.
Yeah, well, so my education background is actually I have a BSN in nursing, and I also have a degree in theology. So I had no intentions of becoming a museum educator, but once I put my pinky toe in the door, it kind of stuck. I've been there ever
As it
since.
does for you.
Yeah.
Who are the educators in the room here? It kind of sticks like that, doesn't
It
it?
sticks that way.
Yeah, it just does.
Hi, Claudia. I've been working with Claudia.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So glad you're here. Yeah, it just kind of sticks. And as all of you are knowing that whatever the museum work is that you choose to do, it may not be a direct path. And in your case, same institution, but not really a direct path. I mean,
Right.
it's different kinds of work. I'm really intrigued by the bridge between art and science. And what that was like. Was that a big transition?
That was a huge transition for me, coming from the science side over to the art side. I had wonderful mentors at the museum. Being able to see things from an artist's point of view was hard for me, because my vision was, this is science is pretty cut and dry with certain things. You still have to do investigations and things like that, but my track was biology. And taking biology and going into dissecting a painting is how it was the approach that my mentor went into. So I actually used my background in dissection to transition me into how to communicate with the painting, so to speak.
Any science folks here? No science people?
Maybe.
Maybe-ish.
A little bit.
A little bit.
Interesting.
My mother's a microbiologist and health and hospital administrator, and my father's a doctor of internal medicine, so I know a fair amount about this, but don't ask me to teach anything about like temporal physics or anything.
Interesting. So let's, thank you for sharing a little bit about your background. So let's, why don't we talk about the Newark Museum? Because obviously a lot of interesting things happening there. You all have the brochure for the Seeing America. And maybe Tricia, you can start off talking about that.
Sure. I think that the image that you see on the screen right now, to me, is sort of really emblematic of the direction that we've taken the American collections in over the past 4 years. And so the booklet that you have in your hand right now is called Seeing America, American Voices. But really, when we, in 2016, moved our Native American collections downstairs and over there This figure you see here is by Jeffrey Gibson. He's a contemporary Cherokee and Choctaw artist. And the figure was really commissioned for that space. Raise your hand if you've never been to the Newark Museum. Oh, you guys have a field trip coming up.
Hi, I'm so sorry. I just wanted to ask how long this program was gonna go on for.
8:30?
8:30? Because we had the room booked for 7:30.
Sorry, we have a program here.
Does it say 8:30 on,
Yep.
what is it, live? 25 Live?
No, we're the Museum Professions Program.
What are you? This is a weird segue. This is real life. Maybe there's not enough rooms. Anyway, when we moved our Native American collections, you can't see them in this slide, but they're to the right and the left of this really kind of stunning figure, which feels both contemporary and timeless. And it's called Come Alive, I Feel Love. Jeffrey Gibson, like I said, he's a contemporary Cherokee artist, but he pulls his references from all over the place. In this case, it's a Pet Shop Boys song. But he created that piece for that space. I went to talk with him about what we were doing and what I had in mind. This is part of a series of figure works that he had created. He's like, I love it, let's do it. This is going to be like the guardian figure for the whole American way. And that's how you feel when you come in that space. I think it wakes the space up. I'm getting a little off track, but we decided at that point to rename the whole American collection Seeing America. It had been called Picturing America, and for some time we had been discussing about the fact that that sounded a little bit quaint and old-fashioned, and that the collections hadn't been dramatically changed for a good 17 or 18 years, right, Shirley? So that it was time for a big rethinking, and the Native American collections became sort of the spark or the wedge that opened up the whole conversation. So a couple years later, big grant later, we really wanted to do something bold with the interpretation that kind of matched the ambition that we had from the beginning. And so the brochure that you have contains these 10 different contributions by different members of the community. They were brought in really with the intention of adding additional voices to the interpretation. So what does that mean? What that basically means is we've got all these big plans for renovating the space and bringing in new acquisitions and old works refurbished. And we realized it would be really boring to put the same old wall labels back on the wall. We needed to do something different. At the time, we had a wonderful colleague in interpretive materials manager, and she said, how about some other people besides the curator gets to talk, right?
Huh.
And so then,
Imagine that.
and I wasn't insulted at all. I was like, actually, that's brilliant, thank you. And then so we had like a cross-departmental committee, and then talk about what does that mean if we're going to bring in a broad, we're going to take a broader look, a broad spectrum of voices. Who should it be? And what you see here is not, again, you can never have the entire world represented by 10 people, but we really tried to get non-art specialists and people from different professions to pick a work and respond to it. These are highly, fairly close to what you see is what they wrote. We didn't do minor editings. We wanted to let people have their own natural voice. So this has been it's been a really nice journey in that sense in terms of trying to connect what we did on the first floor. Those of you who haven't been here before, we have our 18th and 19th century collections down that hallway. You see the neoclassical sculpture, the Greek slave there. We very intentionally wanted to draw a parallel between Jeffrey's figure and the neoclassical piece. The same height, very different attitudes, different stances and everything. But carrying through that broad perspective all the way through onto the second floor, where we have our modern and contemporary galleries.
So Shirley, all of this transition and what's happening in your universe along the same lines as reinventing this collection.
So with bringing Native America down from our second floor, which was kind of tucked back in the corner, and adding it to the front half of the collection, as far as school groups are concerned, that's one of the departments that I oversee. That story, having that storyline and having a stronger connection to the curriculum made things easier as far as professional development for teachers, seeing the progression, and having something in our American Gallery. One of the things that we're missing, I can remember being an educator and having students from our district, which is the North School District, not have anything that resembled what they look like. And we used to have questions, where is the representation of Newark here? Which I love the reinterpretation that was done to the second floor. Because not only do we have the mayor of Newark, who is also a student of Newark, represented in the galleries, we have the superintendent of Newark Public Schools, who was also a student of Newark, represented in the galleries, and we also have an artist that lives in Newark, has work, his studio is in Newark, and that's represented in the gallery. So now we have something of substance to say to our community, we hear you, you're not obsolete, you're actually represented here, and we actually have references on the wall right now that we can take them to. So from where I came from in the beginning, where it was 18th, 19th, 20th century art with very little representation of our community represented there, to now having this wonderful space that we can bring students through and make a very personal connection is awesome.
I love it. And Tricia, you were also talking about how this, the move of the Native American collection didn't necessarily lead to the rethinking of the African art installation, but there was connectivity there.
Yeah, so before, in 2015, when I came into this position, it was written into my job description that I would help install the Native American collection, essentially in the American galleries. That's the part that, you know, it may be academic to some people, but I think for a lot of people it feels like, oh wow, that finally feels right. You have to go through the Native American galleries to get into the, I mean, it's all kind of mixed together. But the part two of that, again, for those of you who haven't been to the museum, as Shirley said, the Native American collection was somewhat tucked away, and right next to it was the African collection, which is, again, stunning material, very vibrant, but a lot of people were missing it simply because of logistics, that they would come in and want to see the special exhibition and then get something to eat and leave, or, you know, go see the planetarium and then leave. So after we moved Native American, we also moved to the African gallery. I think a pretty key part of this is the opening of the front door. Could you go to the next slide? Is that okay? Because up until a year ago, you see this is the museum on the left with its refurbished, newly reopened original entrance. Just about a year ago, right?
Yeah.
And it had been 20 years of that door being locked. They're not the glass doors that you see now, the big, beautiful brass doors, sealed shut and a sign saying go around the corner to get in. And that was really, I think, a pragmatic move on the part of the museum because we don't have enough exhibition space. We still don't have enough exhibition space. But we made the decision that we needed to move things around and open up, like literally give that physical message that the museum is open and welcoming. Which you can see, hard to see because of the lighting, but now you can see into the museum from the street. You can see some of the beautiful artwork that's in the lobby, and also when you're inside, you can see the city. So there's that connection that you're not in some little vault away from the world, but it's much more fluid. And so now when you come in that door, you see, oh, there's a lot for me to go see here, but one of the first things you see to your right is the Arts of Global Africa. That gallery is sitting there waiting for you, pulling you in. That might be the way that you end up getting to the American galleries. So we really have worked to try and change the feng shui, the accessibility, and I think, you know, that term accessibility, when we made that decision, there was a big big capital project, we barely pulled it off, I think we're still trying to get our sea legs in terms of like how much work and how much investment it took on the part of the institution. But a big part of it was becoming ADA accessible, because we didn't have, you can't get a wheelchair up those steps, obviously. So we ended up building a whole ramp that goes around the side, it's beautiful, so that everybody can get in. Everybody can get in from the front, you don't have to get on like 2 different elevators to get around. And that was a humongous step forward for the institution.
And does that change the feel of the visitor experience? School groups, family programs, I would think that whole change of the physical space, the lobby space, changes the whole dynamic of that experience.
Yes, it has, with the exception of the school groups still do not use the front entrance because the buses would have to open up because of lanes of traffic, so we still use the south wing door, which was originally for school groups to come into the museum that way. But as far as family groups are concerned, new visitors, all other visitors coming through the front door and staying this wide open space. There's a wonderful mural that was done by
Dealey Donald and
Yes.
Lisa?
That actually, it's an African artist, so that space is breathtaking when you walk in.
Is that the big color?
Yes, the big colorful one
Love it.
around. And actually, when you walk through the front door, every archway that you look into, there's a piece of artwork that you can see that represents different groups. So that space in itself, the welcoming center is what we call it, is how everyone comes through the front door with the exception of the school groups. We still have to figure out how to make that happen safely.
One step at a time.
One step at a time, yeah. So the
Well-
doors are open.
So, having said that, one of the things that some of you might remember from, excuse me, from our conversation with Cinnamon Catlin and the Good Co., she talked about the concept of decolonization and making change is not a done deal. It's not like all of a sudden you wake up one day and now we're decolonized, or now we're inclusive, or now we're diverse. Does anybody remember how she kind of phrased that? David?
The way she phrased it is, the work is never done.
The work is never done, exactly. And so it occurs to me that what you all have described is terrific in and of itself, but that it's certainly not done. That it's constantly evolving and learning about how to best use the space, maximize access to collections. And with that in mind, we were talking about this earlier, this word decolonization is not really a word that we were much using 10 years ago, right? Inclusivity, diversity, it all is kind of a cyclical thing. It keeps on moving through over all the decades that some of us have been in the museum field. And it's certainly not, it is work that is never done. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what I call the burden of the legacy of the Newark Museum. Certainly, John Cotton Dana didn't have in mind decolonization, but he did have in mind being inclusive of community and community engagement. So I wonder if either of you might want to talk about the benefit and the burden of that legacy.
Sure. I think one of the burdens of having that legacy is always having to be considered the forerunner of things because of John Cotton Dana, and everyone knows that name and associated with the Newark Museum. So we are expected to be in the forefront of everything. But having gone through a few reconstructions at the museum, having our front doors closed for 20 years, kind of made a separation between us and the community. His legacy is very community rich. Going back to one of the programs we did a couple years ago, we called it 6750, which referenced the riots of 1967 that happened in Newark. And the museum played a very important part of bringing the community back together. It was a place where people could come and vocalize how they felt, to kind of, it was like a bridge between, it was, if you don't know what the riots were about, it was sort of what's happening now, where there was a divide between the police and the residents of the city. And there was a huge, it was really, I wasn't born then, but the riots really, it destroyed certain wards of the city. So the North Museum opened up its doors and utilized the arts to bring a connection for the people in the community. We celebrated I don't want to say celebrate, but we recognize the 50th anniversary of those riots at the museum, trying to do what was done in '67. Because our doors have been closed for 20 years, there was a disconnect, and we lost, due to financial reasons in 2010, about a third of our staff. So having that happened, we kind of was spiraling a little bit. So we use this opportunity of having our front doors open to kind of reconnect with the community, and falling back on what we knew with John Cotton Dana and making sure that our community is represented in the museum, making sure that all voices can be heard, so to speak. Now, it is difficult to say all voices can be heard because we can't do that, but what we can do is work with what we have. And work with what's around us. And right now, the city looks very different than it did in 1967. There's sort of a renaissance that's going on in the city of Newark right now. We're kind of encased by Rutgers University, which they say we're sitting in the middle of their campus.
You're like, wait a minute.
Yeah. But we having those front doors open, a whole new generation of people that we can reach who have no idea who John Cotton Dana was, who have no idea what the breadth of the collection of the North Museum, what we have to offer. So the challenge now is to go out and reach this entirely new generation and expose them to the artwork that's at the museum. So it's good, but then it's a challenge.
Well, I know that, Tricia, you also brought a brochure. I know some of the pictures in the slide deck are from the Wendy Red Star exhibition, which is an entirely different community than what you've been describing, Shirley. So maybe you can talk a little bit about Wendy Red Star and how this is all transpiring.
Sure. Do you want to flop ahead to the slides? I think we can always move back. And these are scenes of, the community. I mean, worth more discussion, but I think hopefully maybe coming up next should be, okay, so this is, Wendy Red Star is our current special exhibition, which means you can only see it for 3 or 4 months at a time, depending on what our calendar is. It opened in February and it's up till June 16th. So I think it's really interesting, the politics of space and the whole problem of how to best use your space is part of decolonizing the museum. Like, we could just put the permanent collection in every gallery. Or we basically gave up some exhibition space so that we could have this generous, very welcoming lobby, right? So we make these decisions. The thing that we gained in this transaction when we moved Native American and African was, somehow we rolled it into the same, campaign, was 5,000 square feet of flexible, brand new exhibition space. So now we can show bigger exhibitions. Hopefully we're more competitive with our neighbors in New York for getting traveling exhibitions that we want to bring to our community. So Wendy Red Star is an example of a show that we built internally. We had Wendy is a contemporary photographer. You see in this slide, there's 3, it's hard to see exactly, but she uses herself as a subject a little bit like Cindy Sherman or Frida Kahlo. These are 3 portraits of her with her daughter. Maybe go to the next one. And then, so she does a lot of photography, a lot of self-portraiture, a lot of working with archival portraits that explore the history of the Crow Nation, the Crow Reservation in Montana, and the whole politics of like real life on the reservation. So there's the late 19th century history of the reservation, and then she's got great images that kind of bring to vivid Technicolor life what it's like to actually be on a Crow reservation, to be Crow. But I think the most decolonizing, and I'd like to say something about that word because I think it sounds a little jargony sometimes, and you can sort of be like roll your eyes and say that sounds really theoretical. But what that word does, it's much stronger than the word like when I was in graduate school in the 90s, we were talking about multiculturalism, which has a much more sort of warm and fuzzy feel, like we're doing multiculti, you know, there's that kind of cute short form of that word, and it became a little bit, it felt a little bit after a while like the whole art world and the world at large was checking boxes, right? And so now you have a language of inclusion and equity, but decolonizing is really forceful. It basically sounds like we're taking this space back, right? It is not just for the settlers, the colonists, right? So that means lots of different things. But what Wendy has done, the show we've titled the show, Wendy Rose Starr's Scratch on the Earth, which is the Crow, a rough translation of the Crow word when they first had to conceive of being penned in on a reservation, that I'm going to make a scratch in the earth and you can't go over it, which was completely foreign to their way of life, right? So Wendy took that concept of boundaries and used it to kind of bring the whole spectrum from historical to contemporary Crow life into the gallery. And in a very literal way, this thing you see in the middle here is a sweat lodge, literally modeled on sweat lodges that are very commonly found on the Crow reservation. It's covered in Pendleton blankets, it's covered in sleeping bags and tarps, the kind of tarps you use for camping. And inside is a pretty incredible immersive film that will transport you to the Montana landscape. So this is a mixing of what some people would consider kind of a ritual or sacred cultural practice. The sweat lodge is where Crow people go to meditate, pray, heal, sweat on a literal level. And it's something that she wanted to share with people. And so, again, I want to make the distinction so that we don't have a confusion. When we were installing this, Wendy lives in Portland, Oregon. She came out and we built this thing and, you know, kind of a lot of sweat going into the whole construction. But she said, I'm already getting haters on Instagram. I'm already getting haters, got other people telling her, you have no right to share what's sacred to our people with other people. And Wendy's response was, what do you mean our people? I'm Crow, you're not Crow, you know, like what? And if you go to the Crow reservation, you will find a certain number of these sweat lodges that are reserved for private use, for ritual use, for healing, and others which are caught up more every day and they dot the landscape. So it's not that she's trying to simulate some sort of, particular ritual inside. In fact, it's a very contemporary art feeling in the whole exhibition that I think, and then she has this real love of the faux nature landscape and the whole natural history tableau, which is where she kind of launched. She grew up on the Crow reservation, then went to UCLA for her master's degree, and kind of started off with, kind of making her culture her subject matter because she missed it, and she felt like other people didn't understand it. And she tells a great story of being in Los Angeles and missing Crow culture and going to the Natural History Museum to find something Crow, and having to go through the dinosaur display to then find a couple pairs of Crow moccasins, and realizing that people understand this at all. So very kind of complex, but also with a sense of humor. And she really doesn't want to be I think she's almost like what am I trying to say? She's challenging for people because she says, please don't just don't treat me as just a Native American artist, I'm a contemporary artist. And there's a whole kind of feminist piece to what she does. And so she forces us to think about our stereotypes and our presumptions. Long-winded way of saying this is a really lovely example of how a special exhibition can help decolonize the museum. And for us, it was a really important way to keep following through. You know, we moved the Native American galleries, we've gotten national attention for what we did in those galleries, but that's not enough, you know? And so we're continuing to collect contemporary Native American art and also to integrate it in the galleries, not just have it in one particular area.
Well, and some of what we've been reading in class, and some of you might recall from the lecture that Cinnamon Catlin Legutko gave us, part of the decolonization challenge is to make the issues contemporary so that we are not just talking about Native American culture as something in the past, or like the dioramas at the Natural History Museum in DC that used to be there in the Hall of Native Americans that I loved dioramas, but they were really from the 50s, interpreting Native American culture from the past and not contemporary. And I'm wondering if the people who have come to your museum, community in the broadest sense, what is their reaction to this exhibit?
I've been
so yes.
Well, dealing with, my larger audience right now is dealing with schools. And the reinterpretations of the galleries is awesome. I mean, I love the galleries myself for the story that it tells from the contemporary work all the way down to the Great Migration, and just taking pieces that you wouldn't ordinarily would want to talk about and have it tell a story in a way that's very relatable to any viewer that's looking at it. So the school groups have had very good responses to it. Parents and families that come in and they utilize the books. They go around and they read the quotes that's making those personal connections. And the fact that we have labels that are in both English and Spanish is another great addition to this transition and making these galleries welcoming to different groups. So we had positive feedback so far.
Any challenges? Any challenges both internally, externally?
Well, I have to say that the bilingual labels were really a challenge. From the beginning, when it was suggested, I knew it was the right thing to do, but from the point of view of the exhibition designer and myself, like, we just did this big renovation to get more space. Now we're going to fill it in with more text because you have to really think things through carefully, because our first thought was, well, we'll just put, have a handheld thing for the Spanish, and then we realized, we can't do that. It has to be one for one. So because we had a pretty generous grant, is I think one of the ways that we were able to pull this off, because we had to bring in a dedicated graphic designer just to handle the label issue. Like, how do you sort of like, it's like nanotechnology almost, to get the fonts right and get everything so that it doesn't look funky on the wall and doesn't look distracting. And so then, again, I think if it's this balance of, we get exciting things done because we're lean staff, but then we also get really log jammed sometimes. In other words, we lost our interpretive materials manager. I think this is real world stuff that's good for you guys to know about if you're going to go into the museum field. We had an interpretive materials manager, and she was driving a lot of these, innovative things, the bilingual and the community labels. And when she left, we no longer had anybody to manage me, for instance. So when I'm writing the regular labels, the what we call the B panels, or like the sort of the mini intro panel that's in each section. If you're back and forth with an editor, and the editor says, "I'm not quite sure what you're saying here. Could you explain?" I'm like, "Oh yeah, I can explain." And your labels can no longer And then we sent him over to the designer, and I thought his head was gonna explode. He was like, I can't put all this on the wall. We had already sent it off to the translator. So I had to go back, I had Will help me, and triage, like, what can we lose here? It's actually, it was really therapeutic because I like being edited. This is the problem, I could use more editors, right? So we did this hack job, we reduced to get down to the pith of what we need to say, what we think we need to say. And then we have to go back and tell the translator, should I go back and editing what you tried? Then we have retranslations. It was really, in that sense, there were moments where I thought we were all just gonna say like, forget it. Because it was really, really challenging. But of course, you look at it now, I mean, when you come and you'll see, it looks lovely. It looks like it was meant to be that way. I think the brevity of the intro panels is good. Because really, I'm a big, like I said, I'm an object person. I like to let the art do the talking. And so let's put our money where our mouth is when it comes to that and have some shorter labels. We'll see.
I'm glad we're recording this.
I know. I'm embarrassed that you're recording it. Some things need to be said.
No, so any other challenges, any pushback from other staff, any pushback from leader? I mean, I know you've had a bit of leadership transition. I'm sure that sort of a stop-start over a number of years, I'm sure that can be a challenge. Surely you've been there for a while.
Yes. Under every directorship that I've been under, there has been a transition where the director has gone in another direction than what we're going in. So it would be a start, stop. The strategic plans, the long-range plans, everything has to change because the new director comes in with a new vision. This is what we need to do. This is the direction we're going in. And of course, with new leadership also comes changes, so you lose people. And when you lose people, now you have gaping holes where you have to move out of your specialty to cover areas that's not your specialty. So now you're juggling and you're trying to replace these people while you're juggling, making sure you don't lose the audience that you have. Still trying to gain new audience, still trying to do the correct interpretation. And when you don't have your interpretation person, as Tricia is saying, now you're saying, okay, where do we want to go with this? And in these transitions, our new director has been here for about a little over 90 days. So there's, she's very energetic. She's excited. She knows where she wants to go, and we kind of have an idea of where she wants to go. But in the meantime, we have this strategic plan that has been in place, and we're kind of like almost in the last year of that plan, 2020. This is somewhere where we are. So it's these start-stop transitions. Especially for people like me who's been there for a long time. I don't want to say I'm used to it because that's something you don't want to get used to. But when I have a little plaque above my desk that says "Expect Change." So with that, working in a museum, there will always be some form of change, especially when it comes down to when you have leadership change, when your community changes, when you have gallery changes. I am very excited about the changes in the gallery because there's been a very stale period of time where nothing changed and you're hungry for change. So with these new galleries, it's like feast, and then you have famine, and then it's feast, and then you have famine. So we're trying to balance out a little bit right now, but the direction that we're going in with the reinterpretation of the American wing and bringing Native America downstairs to the first floor in Africa and moving the Mediterranean out of the little nook that was against the wall. Now it's out in the open, so having this fresh new look at everything is refreshing. So now I'm just kind of in the period of, okay, we're in feast, but you having an unsure foot doesn't feel good sometimes. you know, you wanna move, and you're saying, okay, can I move? Is this the direction that we're going in? You, from a programming point of view, we know what direction we wanna go in, but we still have a whole senior management that says, hold on a minute. And then you have all of these gaping holes that you also have to cover. So it's a lot to juggle at this time. So the museum world is very interesting, which is probably why it was never on my radar as a career before I went.
And here you are.
Too deep now.
I'm in too deep now.
Too
yeah.
late now.
Yeah.
But what you just described, Shirley, is what I know to be true about the museum field and what I talk to students about all the time, and that is the nature of change, volatility, uncertainty, ambiguity. It's all part of what museums are. And so however certain you feel you are at any given moment, the next moment might be completely different. And so to be resilient and flexible amidst all that kind of change. And then at the same time, moving forward on important things, the
Right.
important kind of work
Right.
that you're doing. Which leads me into the last question I want to ask you, and then I want to open it up to all of you to provide any questions or comments. And that is, we talked a little bit about the legacy of the museum and John Cotton Dana. But in the context, in the pantheon of the museum field and a lot of changes that are impacting the field and society, would you say that the work that you're doing at the museum is driven by some of those changes, or is it really just like the conversations around diversity and inclusion that are really hot button issues in the field, decolonization? Is the Newark Museum reacting to some of that conversation, or are you just going your way because it's the thing to do?
I would say, as far as the American collection goes, that we are simply playing to our strengths. Because the legacy, John Cotton Dana's legacy in terms of the collections are that we have a much more richer and variegated and interesting collection than a lot of other American collections that I've looked at. And I'm not saying like, it's not a competitive thing, it's just that for me, what an honor to be the custodian of the collection of American art. I've really been trying to look at the history and pull the things that I think, oh, look, we have this already, let's, oh, why shouldn't we be talking, we should have a permanent installation on the Harlem Renaissance. We have a historical African-American collection, let's make sure that it's always out, right? And when one of the areas that so no, I don't think that we're reactive. I think, I'm not saying we did it first, but we've been doing it since 1914. We started collecting Native American art in 1914. We now have a collection of North American Native American art that is extremely high quality, and it's not thoroughly comprehensive, but we can take you from, the Southeast to the West Coast up to Alaska. We can take people on quite a journey with our Native American collections, and we have rotations for the next, wonderful objects we can keep rotating in. And a lot of museums, again, not comparing, it's not a competition, but John Cotton Dana naturally encouraged thinking of everything as art. Like art is everywhere, art is part of daily life, you just need to see it. And he went and with his curators and himself around the globe, collecting in that way, that not saying, oh, that's applied art, oh, that's craft, no, it's a beautiful object. Our audiences need to see it and understand it. So, of course, we are involved in national level conversations about decolonizing, what to do with indigenous collections. But I'm very proud of the history, and from a curatorial perspective, of course, programming as well. From collecting and exhibition history, what we've done, we're simply continuing in that tradition and trying to improve it.
Anything you want to add, Shirley?
One sentence. We have not reacted, but we do respond. And we respond through our programming.
responding. So with that said, any questions that you have for Shirley or Tricia related to anything they talked about or something that's on your mind from class? Ellie?
So you said you've worked with native artists. Have you ever worked with native tribes with either, like how to display the items or within the exhibition process itself?
So Ellie's asked, you've worked with, like Wendy Red Star, you're working with native artists, but have you worked with native tribes?
Yes. So again, when we were reinstalling the Native American collection, I had this sort of naive idea that we would just pull the collection out of, pull some new things out of storage, clean them up and put them out. And that's the reason why I wasn't in charge, because I'm not a specialist in this material. I brought in a fantastic lead curator who's a plain specialist, and I could tell she was the right person because she said, I'm a collaborative curator. I know where my knowledge stops, where we have to bring in indigenous curators, so that's what we did. She brought in a Northwest Coast specialist, a Lakota specialist, a Navajo specialist, a Hopi specialist, a Pomo specialist. And so we have, each of those areas are curated by somebody from that culture, and the wall text is written in their voice. And I will acknowledge that the one place we have great room to improve, and if we could ever get a full-time or even a part-time curator of American art on staff, we would do it, is to develop our Lenape holdings, because we don't have very much at all, as Shirley indicated, to acknowledge that we're on Lenape land. And that, when we were doing that installation, I'll be brief because I know there's other questions, but it was really fascinating to get in touch with the Ramapo and the Nanticoke Colonial Lenape communities. We wanted, they gave us our blessing. They supported the whole installation, but they said, no offense, but this is just more of the same for us. We're not here. And so for that first installation in 2016, we actually borrowed a wampum belt from one of the chiefs Nanticoke Council. It was a one-year loan. Now we don't have it, but we did go ahead and acquire a Delaware bag, and that whole interesting, heartbreaking relationship between the New Jersey tribes, who are not federally recognized, and the Delaware of Oklahoma, is something that I hope we continue to navigate, but it requires leadership. It requires really somebody permanently on staff that has much deeper specialization than me.
Jennifer, you had a question.
First off, thank you. It's great hearing, great insights. Earlier you talked about some challenges, and one of them was bringing in this bilingual aspect and bringing in these labels and things like that. And I got the impression that a lot of the reason you were able to do that was because of this new grant and a lot of new research, and the fact that the New York Museum has these resources. What kind of suggestions would you have for maybe smaller museums or museums with less resources for making them, for making their museums bilingual and kind of perpetuating this process of decolonization?
So Jen's question was regarding the implementation of bilingual labels, and you suggested that you were able to do that because of a significant grant that you got. And your question, Jen, is what recommendations might you have for an organization with less resources, still interested in doing that kind of work? That generally your question?
Yeah. I would suggest one of the things that we used to do, in particular with families in schools that came in, the handouts that we would give out would be bilingual, and that's a lot cheaper to do than the wall labels. And we also offer programming that's done in multiple languages. So that's another way to kind of integrate multilingual learning at the museum. So it's there's different things that you can do. This was a very big step for us to have this one space done completely from end to end. And for smaller museums, if you don't have the funding for that, it's going to be really difficult to do. So I would start with the bilingual learning lessons.
Well, and your point, Shirley, is any step is better than no step.
Yes. Yes.
So based on the limitations of your resources, taking any kind of action and that small step, that small change can actually lead
Right.
to something much bigger. Petra.
I'd just love to add on to that. At the same time, it's sort of like if you think of it, it's such a fundable thing. You know, like I don't know what your situation is, but like even when we commissioned that piece from Jeffrey Gibson, I was told, oh, you can't put that in there. We have water that comes into that. This is like beautiful skylit atrium. I was like, well, then we'll need to fix that.
Yeah.
You know, because this is that, Jeffrey's piece is made of hide and all these organic materials. So that became the wedge. And I know you don't necessarily have like a full big development department to help you if you're a little museum or a little art space, but there are like state and local grants as well that, I mean, everybody wants to see these things happen. So in some ways, if you think of it, you push it a little bit, I think the funding can then be borne out from there.
Petra.
Yeah, Tricia, I was very happy that you kind of made the distinction between decolonization and multiculturalism and diversity and inclusion. I don't think they're the same thing. And it's not only, I think, a question of degree, it's also a little bit about different kind of things, right? I mean, I was just reading the art newspaper, and it's all about Europe giving back their collections. You know, all the museums in Europe right now want to return their collections to Africa, it's also, I mean, what you're doing, I think, with the curators, the Native American curators, that to me is more like decolonization. Spanish labels, to me, is more inclusivity. They're both good, but I think we shouldn't really kind of put them all in the same basket. I'm not sure whether you agree, but.
Well, I mean, I do agree. I think that there's all of these, it's almost like this, like a network of different directions that we try to work in. Like some of the slides we show are, you know, having people come and create like wall signs that they can say what they think freedom means to them and stick it on the front lawn of the museum. You know, that's sort of a different use of the museum space than you would have had in the early 20th century. So part of it is collections, part of it is like the voices that you have on the walls, and part of it is the way that you inhabit the space, right?
But Petra, your point is a good one, that we shouldn't confuse decolonization with diversity and inclusive practice. They're related, but they are distinctly different because they mean completely different things. So you're not engaging in decolonization practices explicitly. You're not giving back your native collection, for example. But have you been requested to? And is there discussion at the museum that you should, for example?
Yeah, is that a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, so repatriation is a big piece of decolonization, and every institution has its, let's say, skeletons in the closet, the areas of its collections that are there that should not be there. And so, yes, it is an ongoing challenge to not let those threads drop. In other words, you know, those of you who are being trained as registrars, you know, it's sort of a federal requirement that if you have objects that are, you know, the tribal affiliation, any association with grave objects or other sacred objects, that you need to go through the process of offering to return them. So yes, we have those, we have repatriation in process, and it's a tremendous burden. You know, it's a burden that has like, I think oftentimes gets swept under the rug. But as our former director said, like, you can't just do the fun stuff with collections, right? Like there's the stuff that everybody feels good about, like, oh, I get to see this, you know, seal gut parka up close and blah, 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 like beautiful craftsmanship, and it's all art, but you know, there's the serious business of our role as custodians that is a huge part of the conversation.
Yeah, and we did have a huge give back with Native American, the early 2000s, under Ann Spitzer. She had a we saw in the cases, several pieces, and said, you should not have those here. And that entire case was taken down at that point. And I don't know what the rest of the process was, I just know it was gone after this curator came in. So that's
Well, and that process has continued with the team of curators that we brought in to reinstall the Native American collection. We have some areas flagged for further study. But there was nothing, and we had some interesting cases where, like a Northwest Coast curator, the whole relationship of an indigenous person to their object is different than the language that we use. Had a case where one of our staff referred to these works as objects, and the curator got really upset. She just they're living things, and she didn't say like it was issue, not like we want to have them back because you're mistreating them. They understood that there was like a careful custodianship happening, but language is powerful. We have to be like constantly checking ourselves and learning, how to navigate those moments.
Ian?
So I'm actually at the sort of question hopping around my head ever since Senator came and talked to us. And since you have a museum with a large collection of Native American artifacts, I was kind of wondering how you work with the very common pervasive notion of the vanishing race when, especially when the objects you're working with are often very specifically designed to fall apart at the seams when time goes by. Native American artifacts wholesale are not generally supposed to last for periods of time. So how can you reconcile even just the nature of the things you're working with this pervasive cultural notion that is still something that Native American tribes are struggling with today?
Well, the name that we gave to our reinstallation was Native Artists of North America, and that was very intentional that we're talking about these as artists, first of all. The way that we display them is it's naturally, there's sunlight coming in, we treat them as art objects, you can get all the way around them, so it's not, I'm sure 100 years from now somebody will find something really oh, we had a blind spot, it's so anthropological, but we really tried to switch it up from the past. So that emphasis on the artist is a very kind of modern concept. And then for us, these individual panels by each of the curators, we included a picture of them. Some of them are in full regalia, others are in a t-shirt, it's great. They're all individual people, individual voices, living cultures. And your question is interesting about the longevity of these objects. They're actually, I hope that you all will come and take a close look. We did a beautiful rotation. But they are organic, and that's why they can't stay out for indefinite periods of time. They're incredibly well crafted. You look at the seams. I keep talking about the steel gut parka because it's one of my favorites. But again, to hear our Native American curator talk about, okay, first of all, you need to know how to hunt a seal. Then you know how to gut it. Then you know how to cure the intestines. Then you need to know how to sew it with grass, sewing it with grass. And these are all skills that you learn from your family down through a long line. So, and again, do we all have that kind of attention span to do that nowadays? So, but anyway, it doesn't look like it's falling apart anytime soon. Really sturdy stuff. And if they're well cared for, they will last for very long periods of time. We've got, some hide pieces from the 19th century. It was a Cherokee coat, totally covered in embroidery. Looks like you could have just got it at, Gucci or something. It's gorgeous. 19th century.
And they rotate them, which is for education purposes. It's no, that's my favorite piece. But they're on rotation, so they're preserved longer. Yeah. So the silk, the jackets.
Yeah.
And now we have the baby ones. They rotate. So.
But the other thing is certain things like the ceramics, those are fine. Those aren't going anywhere. Same thing with an oil painting. You don't have to rotate that because it's made somebody figured out how to make it so that it's non-perishable.
A lot of times we sort of like incorporate decolonization with NAGPRA and like Native Americans and stuff, but you guys also have like a really impressive collection of Tibetan art. And you know, at the turn of the 20th century, Tibet was kind of a rocky area. So have you guys ever gotten any sort of backlash or like, you know, repatriation things with the Tibetan collection? Or?
The question is about issues related to the Tibetan collection.
I have not heard, of course, it's a whole other area of specialization that I have very little to do with, but I haven't heard anything about that. In fact, our altar has been blessed by more than one Dalai Lama. I don't know what the sensitivities is. I'm sure that if we could beam in our Asian curator, she would have some interesting stories. I mean, certain materials and certain ritual objects probably can't even be acquired. But I don't believe that we have huge issues with the Tibetan collection.
I haven't heard of any since I've been there. Yeah.
Amanda?
Okay, so you referenced or discussed earlier about how you brought in curator specialists and indigenous curators to help you with your collections, but what other kind of like collaborative efforts have you done with other schools or museums to help with just like any other aspects of your museum? Like do you, like how closely do you work with like the school systems in Newark or other museums, whether it's in like New York or like throughout the state? Like, can you just like give me a little insight on that?
So generally the question is about what kind of collaborations, partnerships that you engage with schools, other organizations, community groups, locally, regionally?
So we do have a pretty robust partnership with North Public Schools, Jersey City Public Schools, Elizabeth Patterson. We work with teachers very closely, curriculum specialists, to prepare the lessons for their students so it's customized for their for all of their classes when they come to the museum. Also for professional development, I work with pretty much every museum in New York, Philadelphia. We go and we kind of have an exchange program with their education department where we kind of exchange techniques on how to reach our public better. Yeah. So working with, we see between 40,000 and 100,000 school kids a year. So working with that many teachers, we saw about 3,000 teachers for professional development at the museum. And we work with all their curriculum specialists to make sure that when they bring their kids to the museum, it's a program that connects the classroom to the objects.
And Amanda, part of your question was, you started off by talking about bringing in indigenous curators to help with that particular collection. And Tricia, you started off talking about including diverse voices in Seeing America. Are there any other opportunities that you have explored or are exploring in terms of bringing in other voices that impact the work you're doing, either in exhibitions or programming?
We do. With our public programming, we do have teaching artists that come in for programs. We have lecturers, we do films. So there's a lot of community organizations we work with. We work with NJPAC, with performers. We work with the Algira. We have connections with other planetariums. So there's a huge pool of people that we actually pull in to make our public programming more robust. So living artists like Ben Jones does lectures at the museum. One of the, actually this coming Sunday, Joe Lopez, who is a new artist that's hanging in the new exhibition, is going to be giving a lecture at the museum. Yes, at the museum this coming Sunday. So we do have these collaborations that are going on.
Great.
Yeah.
Ibrahim, you had a question?
Yes. I'm sorry. Other education question. Okay. Can you speak to, so New York City city schools, North has just gained control of their schools.
Yes.
Can you speak to how that might impact both of your departments and the way that you might conduct your processes? So going through this concept of decolonizing the museum has to be intentional, and often it has to make people very uncomfortable. How will that affect your process, especially understanding that the population of students in the North City schools are primarily African American or Latino, for the most part?
Well, as far as the permanent collection of American art goes, modern and contemporary are in good shape. If you guys haven't been to see it, come and see it. It's just, it's really lively, and as a colleague of mine said, there's not a single cliche here. And part of that, I mean, we've got like the canon. We've got, Robert Motherwell. We've got, Edward Hopper. We're not like burning all of the, white artists in the collection or anything like that. Those works are still there, but there is room for sort of a more layered conversation, just as way that American history is not a single narrative. What we try to do is bring in like a real range of narratives. We can forward in the PowerPoint just a little bit to the, yeah, this is a good place to start because it's really the first gallery if you're going to go through a chronological narrative of modern and contemporary American art. You start in this gallery, which we call the modern era. But it's not like the mayor is always standing there, but the mayor is he happens to be standing right next to his label that he wrote, which to me it almost feels like a blessing for the whole floor. And you've got it in your pamphlet that you can read it. But we've kind of flowed from there with this tone of like, look carefully, and the next gallery, can you go one more? The next, let's go one more. This gallery is it's just a little teaser, okay? If you haven't been to see this and you'll be like, okay, I can't see that very well, so I'm gonna go see it in person. But the gallery to your left, where you see some, shapes, is a completely new gallery that we've called Indigenous Modern. And this is replacing a gallery that used to be called the Late Gilded Age. So the Late Gilded Age was beautiful, right? Beautiful, like American Impressionist landscape painting, but it was very much about a certain time, place, attitude that had to do with being of a certain class. And there was even like a quote written on the wall, something to the effect of like, why would you want to look at anything ugly? Like there's so much beauty in the world. It's very kind of aesthetic, So now we've replaced that entirely with a gallery that looks from pre-Columbian textiles to contemporary Native American ceramics, and in between, like where did the abstract art come from? And so that I think when you get off that like rigid, let's look at every category that happened, you give up the idea that there was this very neat single progression. There was abstract art at the beginning, in the middle, and the end, and there was, Ashcan school, people looking at the gritty realism of America at the same time that you have beautiful idealized landscapes. So kind of seeing in a big picture. So those galleries I don't think need work at the moment. We just worked really hard to get them looking great. Now I do think if we had the staff and we had the money, we could go back in the 19th century and do some really good work and make it a little bit more multivocal, right?
Definitely, thank you for your response. But I was
That's what you meant?
No, yeah, just a little bit. But more so, I'm interested in how museums can enhance the educational experience for the students primarily. So this idea of changing the narrative or having more pieces that represent who you are or who you might be in your community, so to speak. And with the new development of the school systems, museum pedagogical approaches are effective. Do you see the museum having some ability to kind of embed itself into the school system, or
Actually, we're their partner.
Mm-hmm.
This past, actually 2 weeks ago, about a week after the opening. The high schools, all of the high schools in Newark, they go through an art competition, we call it the Teen Arts. This is the 47th year of this being in existence, where all of the high schools in Newark develop their artwork as a competition and is displayed at the museum. This year we did something a little bit different because we do have a new superintendent with the schools, and we have a new director. We went a little bit deeper, and all of their artwork was focused on our Scene America gallery. So their show is called My America. So we were able to send them digital images of what's in the gallery, and they were able to kind of riff off of the artwork that was in the galleries. And their show is actually still hanging at the museum right now. It's going to be down on Friday, so you'll have to come and see it before then. But that's one of the ways that we connect a little bit deeper. It wasn't just visual art, it was also performance art. So there was spoken word, they did instrumental, so we had acoustic guitars playing in the second floor galleries. They did performance art, like there was a dance routine that was done based on the Harlem Renaissance. So there is a deeper connection. We work with the art curriculum and the art teachers from every high school to put this show on. Yeah.
Kate?
I kind of have two questions, and I don't know that they relate to each other at all, but my first being, have you seen any kind of changes in visitorship or demographics since these changes have been instituted? Is there a wider reach that's happening, or more programming that has occurred?
So the question is, any change in visitor demographics or visitorship since you've been implementing these major changes?
I want to say that the change in visitorship has to do with us reopening our front doors and just how the museum now has a face, so to speak, with the front doors being closed for so long, and just opening those front doors. This is the cherry on top. So I think with that and the type of programming that we can now do around this wonderful space is going to draw more people in.
And then your other question?
My follow-up question was, you talked a lot about moving galleries within the museum and kind of relocating to more accessible locations. Are there plans to do that with some of the other galleries as well? Or, I guess the follow-up was kind of like why these specific galleries were the ones that needed to move, you thought?
So you talked about moving basically the ethnographic collections. Why those, and are there plans to move others?
Well, I think the why is more than one reason, but they were modest enough in scale that we can handle it. Same thing with what Shirley was mentioning, the Mediterranean. So we have a beautiful, small but really strong classical collection that crosses Greece, Rome, and Egypt. I think that was also really tucked away. The school groups loved it, but most people didn't even know it was there. And now it's like right in your pathway. So the only thing left really to move, the other collections that are really left to move are Asian, which is vast. We really need a whole new building. I'm telling the public. Because we could do a great renovation on the Asian collection the way we did in American. But it's still that thing of like getting all the way up to the third floor. It's kind of heartbreaking because it's such a wonderful, amazing collection. But even when I'm giving a tour, I say like, oh, you're not going to make it up. We've got to get up and see.
You have to have better signage.
We are working on. Have you noticed it's gotten better? You still don't like it?
Well, I don't really pay attention, but it is hard to find the elevators
Yes.
tucked away in the back.
So we really are an agglomeration of about 4 different buildings, and we have been working on improving the wayfinding, and I think opening the front door helped tremendously with that,
Oh, yeah.
because you could at least understand the structure of the main building.
Right.
But yeah, ways to go.
Hannah?
So getting back to what you talked about, being the Indigenous galleries and the work by Wendy Red Star, you said that she had received some pushback from people who weren't necessarily pro about the work that she was doing. have you as a museum ever received pushback or complaints from Native American people about the exhibits that you're doing in the museum? Ever had, those issues of mistrust with Native American groups, and if so, how do you handle it?
Any pushback, issues of mistrust from Native groups about the work you're doing?
Well, I think Shirley gave one example that predated me of a specialist coming and identifying grave goods.
Great.
And certainly, I think what we did in 2016, and again, I don't take credit for it, I didn't pick out a single object, is like vast improvement over the feel of the old installation, which was much more anthropological. But no, we kind of, because of these specialists and because of the wonderful lead curator we had, we made sure that, for instance, we have Kaxinam, or Kachina dolls out, but we had a Hopi specialist handpick which ones are appropriate for public audience. We have other ones in the collection that we would not take out. With our Northwest Coast things, we had the Northwest Coast specialist who, I think we remounted this raven rattle 3 times, so we got it right. So it matches its ritual use in terms of the way it's presented. So we're really doing some very careful work. I mean, we're not perfect, but we got things to fix still, but we have tried very hard to not put ourselves in a position where we would get those kind of critiques.
Okay, we have time for one more question. David?
So my main question is regarding community relations, like what Professor Stevens remarked about the uncertainty, ambiguity, and volatility surrounding change within how the museum works and how it reflects in the community. My main question is primarily, how do you keep those community relations alive? I guess more specifically, what's the core of how you guys keep your community relations strong? Like, how do you know what the community wants? How do you know if people say, like, hey, we have these artists that deserve to be exhibited? So I guess I could probably say, what's your core at keeping the community relationships alive, especially with knowing what the community wants?
Boots on the ground. You have to go out. You have to, I always say you have to lead a trail from the community back to the museum. So if you're not going out and you're not making those connections, a lot of times they don't know what you have to offer. And we can't rely on the little flyers, the pamphlets, social media. A lot of times face-to-face and hearing someone's voice and seeing a representative is the best way to go. So that's my approach, especially when it comes to the audience that I oversee, school, youth, and family. It's boots on the ground.
Oh, I would say something similar.
Yeah.
That for me, we are in the middle of an incredibly rich community of artist-run galleries and vibrant community organizations. So it's really hard because I have a lot of work to do at my desk. But I really try to get out and as much as possible visit, go to the open studios, go to openings when I can, do studio visits with particular art. I mean, it's a problem because there's always going to be somebody. We get much, much more offer of, exhibition ideas and artwork than we would ever be able to accommodate. So a lot of it is diplomacy and like warmly saying, please understand that our collections outstrip our means to take care of them, and we have a really, really packed exhibition schedule. And I think one of the hardest parts about that community versus the quality of the collections is having that balance between, we are like one of the best museum collections in the country, and therefore we can't always represent everyone in the community. Right. We have to be selective. It's the nature of the museum business.
And for those of you who have read Excellence and Equity, your comment, Tricia, is really that. It is about maintaining the integrity of your collections and what you are as an institution, and being as open and inclusive and equitable to your communities as possible. So Tricia and Shirley, thank you so much for encourage you, for the handful of my education students will be at Newark Museum on Thursday night. So I'm looking forward to that. And if you haven't been to the Newark Museum, you absolutely